The HOA president's gavel slammed down so hard it cracked the plastic folding table. Dr. Elena Vasquez, you are directly responsible for the $2.8 million in flood damages that destroyed our community trail system. Elena stood in the packed community center, 60 pairs of hostile eyes burning into her as Richard Brennan's voice echoed off the walls. Outside, the remnants of Hurricane Delilah's destruction were still being cleared. Massive oak trees that had crashed across the walking paths, erosion channels that had carved 6-foot gullies where families used to jog, and the complete obliteration of the boardwalk system that had been the neighborhood's pride. Your constant interference and environmental extremist demands prevented us from taking proper protective measures. Brennan continued, his face red with manufactured outrage. If you hadn't blocked our drainage improvements with your tree hugging. Nonsense. I submitted a comprehensive flood mitigation report 6 months ago, Elena interrupted, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. In March, I warned you exactly what would happen during this summer's storm season. Warnings from a homemaker who thinks she knows better than professional contractors, Brennan scoffed. The crowd murmured agreement. Mrs. Vasquez, you've been nothing but an obstructionist since you moved here in January 2024. What none of them knew, what Brennan had deliberately concealed, was that Elena wasn't just another concerned resident. She held a PhD in environmental engineering from MIT, had consulted for FEMA on residential flood management for 8 years, and had authored the federal guidelines that half the construction companies in the state were required to follow, the $47,000 environmental impact study she'd conducted at her own expense and submitted to the HOA in March had predicted Hurricane Delilah's destruction with terrifying accuracy, down to the specific trail sections that would fail first. But Brennan had buried her reports because implementing her recommendations would have cost his construction company the $380,000 contract for quick drainage fixes. That had not only failed catastrophically, but had actually made the flooding worse. Now, faced with insurance, investigators asking uncomfortable questions about ignored expert warnings, he needed a scapegoat. And the quiet woman who'd been raising inconvenient questions about soil stability and water table analysis seemed perfect. For the role, Elena had moved to Riverside Meadows thinking she could finally have a normal life. Away from disaster zones and emergency consultations, her daughter Sophia, now 16, had been excited about starting fresh at a new school after Elena's divorce from her workaholic ex-husband who'd never understood her passion for preventing the very disasters he claimed were just acts of God. The community had seemed perfect mature forest canopy, natural drainage systems, and existing trail infrastructure that could be enhanced rather than rebuilt. She'd planned to keep her professional background quiet, maybe volunteer for the environmental committee, help maintain the delicate ecosystem that made their neighborhood so beautiful. Instead, she'd found herself watching Brennan's crews, preparing to clear-cut a 2-care section of old-growth forest that served as the natural buffer against flood surges. Her first attempt to speak up at a February meeting had been dismissed politely. Her second attempt in March, accompanied by detailed hydrological data, had been labeled unnecessary alarmism. By April, when she'd presented her complete analysis showing that Brennan's proposed drainage system would funnel floodwaters directly into the residential areas instead of dispersing them safely, she'd been branded a troublemaker. The personal attacks had started in May. Anonymous notes in her mailbox calling her a crazy tree lady. Whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Sophia coming home from school asking why her classmates' parents were saying Elena was trying to ruin their property values. The social isolation had been devastating, but Elena had persisted because she knew with the certainty that came from 20 years of studying natural disaster patterns that the summer storm season would be brutal. Hurricane Delilah had made landfall on July 23, 2024, with winds of 95 miles per hour and 18 inches of rain over 6 hours. The storm had followed exactly the path Elena had predicted, hitting their community with precisely the surge patterns she'd mapped out in her ignored reports. The improved drainage system had failed within the first hour, sending torrents of water cascading through the residential areas instead of safely channeling it away. The cleared forest sections had offered no resistance to the wind, allowing massive trees to topple directly onto the trail system. Every single element of destruction had been preventable with the $180,000 in conservation. Measures Elena had recommended less than half the cost of the emergency repairs now facing the community. But standing in that community center, with insurance adjusters taking notes in the back row and her neighbors treating her like a pariah, Elena realized that the truth might not be enough. Brennan had spent months painting her as an unstable outsider whose environmental obsessions threatened their way of life. The fact that she'd been absolutely right about everything might not matter if he could successfully frame the disaster as her fault for preventing proper preparations. The meeting had been called for 7 p.m. on August 15th, ostensibly to discuss recovery plans, but clearly designed as a public trial with Elena as the defendant. Brennan had spent the first 20 minutes detailing the extent of the damage, showing photographs of destroyed trails and flooded homes, building the crowds. Anger to a fever pitch before pointing his finger directly at her. Now, as the accusations flew and voices rose, Elena realized she was facing a choice: retreat quietly and let herself be destroyed, or fight back with the full weight of her professional credentials and documented evidence. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You've said enough," someone shouted from the back. "You've done enough damage," another voice added. But Elena had spent too many years in emergency response situations to be intimidated by an angry crowd. She'd testified before congressional committees about billion-dollar infrastructure failures. She'd stood in flood zones while hurricanes approached, directing evacuation efforts that saved thousands of lives. She'd written the playbook that federal agencies used to prevent exactly the kind of preventable disaster that had just devastated their community. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steady and professional, "you received my environmental impact assessment on March 12, 2024. The report was 127 pages long and included detailed hydrological modeling, soil composition analysis, and specific recommendations for flood mitigation measures costing $180,000. You buried that report because implementing it would have cost your construction company the contract for your ineffective drainage system." The room fell silent. Brennan's face went pale. "You're lying," he stammered. "You never submitted any professional report. You're just a Dr. Elena Vasquez," she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd kept hidden for 8 months. MIT, Environmental Engineering, class of 2006, FEMA, consultant from 2016 to 2023, author of Federal Emergency Management Agency publication 48OB, Residential Flood Mitigation in Forested Communities. "I predicted every aspect of this disaster, down to the specific trail sections that would fail first. And I have documentation proving that you received and deliberately ignored my professional recommendations." The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Then someone in the crowd whispered, "Holy shit, she's that Dr. Vasquez, the one who saved that whole town in Louisiana." Elena had hoped to never relive the Baton Rouge incident, where her last-minute intervention had prevented a levee failure that would have flooded 12,000 homes. But as she watched recognition dawn on faces throughout the room, she realized that her reputation might finally serve a purpose. Beyond professional advancement, it might deliver the justice her community desperately needed. Brennan was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly searching for something that would restore his credibility. But Elena had spent 6 months documenting every interaction, every ignored warning, every attempt to silence her professional expertise. The truth was about to emerge, and with it, the real story of how a corrupt HOA president had sacrificed his community's safety for personal profit, then tried to destroy the one person who could have prevented it all. The clock on the wall showed 7:47 p.m. in 13 minutes. Elena's entire life was about to change again, but this time, she was ready for the fight. The recognition spreading through the crowd shifted the room's energy like a weather front moving in. Elena could see neighbors leaning toward each other, smartphones emerging as people began searching her name. But Brennan wasn't finished with his attack. "I don't care what degrees you claim to have," he said, though sweat beaded on his forehead. "The fact remains that you obstructed necessary improvements to our drainage system. Your constant complaints and demands for environmental reviews delayed critical work by 4 months. The work that failed catastrophically 12 hours into the storm." Elena's response was calm, professional. "Mr. Your drainage system didn't just fail. Brennan, it made the flooding worse." Elena Vasquez's voice was calm, but carried weight. "Instead of dispersing stormwater through the forest buffer zones, which you insisted on clearing you, funneled it straight into our homes. Margaret Chen, a retired teacher 3 houses down, rose slowly. Wait, Richard, are you saying Dr. Vasquez is actually a professional environmental engineer, not just a concerned homeowner? Brennan's jaw clenched. It doesn't matter what she claims to be. Chemistry's been a thorn in our side since day one, some kind of environmental extremist trying to halt progress. Environmental extremism? The voice came from the back. Sofia Vasquez, Elena's 16-year-old daughter, still in her Riverside High soccer uniform. She had her mother's spine and her father's courtroom instincts. Mom predicted the exact range of dates when the flooding would hit, which trails would collapse, even which basements would flood. And you called her crazy. Sophia, you don't need to, Elena began. Yes, I do. Sophia's voice rang across the hushed room. I've watched my mom cry herself to sleep. For months over this. She spent $47,000 of her own money on flood studies to protect this community. And you all treated her like garbage for it. A ripple moved through the crowd. No one had known the cost except Sophia. Tom Rodriguez, whose house was next to the worst trail collapse, raised his hand. Dr. Vasquez, did you really spend nearly $50,000 of your own money? $47,000, Elena said quietly. That covered soil core sampling, hydrological modeling, and 3D storm surge simulations. The full report went to the HOA board, the county emergency office, and the state environmental agency. I emailed it on March 12th. Brennan stepped forward, defensive. That's a lie. We never received anything official. Then explain this, Sophia said, pulling out her phone. Email, March 12th, 2024, 3:47 p.m. From Dr. Elena Vasquez to Richard Brennan, HOA President. Subject, Urgent Environmental Impact Assessment. Attachment, Riverside Meadows, _flood mitigation, _assessment, _final.pdf, 127 pages. The room watched Brennan's face twist from denial to panic. I may have received something, but it was completely unrealistic. The recommendations would have cost hundreds of thousands and blocked necessary improvements. What kind of improvements? Dr. Patricia Williams, a local physician, leaned in. My basement flooded for the first time in 12 years. Your new drainage system was supposed to prevent that. Elena took a breath. This was the moment she'd dreaded on, the moment she'd prepared for. The report identified 17 critical vulnerabilities. The biggest was removing the Oak Grove buffer. That grove absorbed runoff for over 60 years. Brennan's plan replaced it with artificial channels designed for normal rain, not storms. The system fails at 4 inches per hour. How much rain did Delilah dump on us? Someone asked. 7 inches in the first hour, 12 inches in the first 3. The forest could have absorbed most of that. The artificial system failed entirely. Brennan was now frantically typing on his phone, likely messaging his lawyer as the room turned against him. Dr. Vasquez asked Janet Morrison, whose home suffered $43,000 in damage. How much would your plan have cost compared to our losses? $180,000 over 6 months. The current damage is over $2.8 million. That doesn't include insurance deductibles or declining property values. The silence that followed was electric neighbors processing betrayal. Realizing their suffering was preventable, Margaret Chen broke it. Richard, did you know about her credentials when you dismissed her? I had no idea. Bullshit, gasps. Filled the room, but Sophia didn't flinch. She introduced herself as Dr. Vasquez at the very first HOA meeting. She offered to volunteer. You knew exactly who she was when you smeared her as an extremist. Elena's pride in her daughter was matched only by sadness that Sophia had to bear this ugliness. But the truth was rising now like the floodwaters. They had tried to stop. There's one more thing, Elena said quietly. The room leaned in. Brennan's construction company, Brennan and Associates, was awarded the drainage contract, $380,000. My plan would have required natural flood management techniques. His company isn't even qualified for that kind of work. A toxic silence spread. Are you accusing me of corruption? Brennan snapped. I'm stating facts, Elena replied. You buried a report that warned your system would fail. You chose profit over safety. Tom Rodriguez stood grim. Richard, did your company do the work? Yes, but we've been in this community for years, and You saw no conflict of interest in rejecting the plan that would have cost you that contract. Dr. Williams' voice was cold and surgical. Brennan was unraveling. His power built on intimidation was collapsing under the weight of facts. But Elena knew this was just the beginning. He wouldn't go quietly. Others had likely profited too. The fight for her family's reputation and justice was far from over. That night, Elena returned home to vandalism. "Tree hugger liar" was scrawled in red spray paint across her garage door. Sophia stood on the porch, arms crossed. I called the police. They said it was probably kids. Without video, there's nothing they can do. Elena stared at the dripping paint like blood on her home. Months of documentation, silence, and diplomacy had ended in this. She was done being polite. Sophia helped me bring up the boxes from the basement. Which boxers? All of them. Her basement office had been her refuge where she'd built a case no one could ignore. She believed in evidence, and she had all of it. The first box contained correspondence with the HOA emails. Certified letters, formal requests, all printed and organized. The paper trail began just 3 days after she moved in, when she first noticed survey stakes marking trees for removal. "Mom, look at this one." Sophia held up a letter dated February 8th. "You offered to do an assessment for free," Brennan replied. "Thank you for your concern, but professional environmental review is not necessary for basic maintenance." Elena reached for a thick folder labeled Credentials, Verification. She wasn't just going to defend her name. She was going to expose everything. Inside were copies of her MIT diploma, her professional engineering license, her FEMA certification, and letters of recommendation from 3 different federal agencies. She'd prepared this package in March, after Brennan's first public attack, on her qualifications, but she'd never had the chance to present it. "Why didn't you show them this stuff months ago?" Sophia asked. "Because I hoped it wouldn't be necessary," Elena admitted. "I moved here to get away from being the disaster expert. I wanted to be just another mom in a nice neighborhood. I thought reasonable people would listen to reasonable concerns without needing a resume to prove I was worth listening to." The second box contained the environmental assessment itself, 127 pages of scientific analysis that had cost Elena $47,000 and 3 months of work by the best environmental engineers in the country. The report was a masterpiece of predictive modeling, using satellite imagery, soil analysis, and hydrological data to create a precise map of flood risks for every section of the Riverside Meadows. Community. Page 23 showed a color-coded danger map that was almost supernatural in its accuracy. The areas marked extreme risk, guaranteed failure, in bright red, corresponded exactly to the sections of trail that had been completely destroyed by Hurricane Delilah, the high-risk probable. Severe damage zones in orange had suffered exactly the kind of erosion and tree loss the storm had produced. Jesus, Mom! The before photos showed mature oak groves creating natural barriers against water flow. The after photos showed clear-cut areas that had become rushing rivers during the storm. You knew exactly what was going to happen. Not exactly, Elena corrected. I knew what would happen if certain conditions were met during a major storm event. I hoped I was wrong. The third box contained Elena's professional background newspaper articles about disasters she'd prevented, commendation letters from grateful communities, and documentation of the $2.4 billion in damage she'd helped prevent over her career. The Baton Rouge levee incident alone had saved 12,000 homes from flooding. Her work on the Houston Bayou system, after Hurricane Harvey had been featured in Civil Engineering magazine, 3 universities had asked her to teach graduate courses in disaster prevention. Mom, you're famous, Sophia said, holding up a Time magazine article from 2019 featuring Elena as one of America's unsung heroes in disaster preparedness. I was famous, Elena corrected. Now I'm just a troublemaker who destroyed a trail system. With environmental extremism, but even as she spoke, Elena felt her confidence returning. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and professionally documented. Brennan had built his attack on the assumption that she was just another concerned homeowner whose opinions could be dismissed. He had no idea that he'd declared war on someone whose expertise was documented by federal agencies and whose track record of preventing disasters was literally written into government policy. The fourth box contained the smoking gun contemporaneous notes from every HOA meeting, board interaction, and community event over the past 8 months. She documented not just what was said, but when, where, and who was present. The pattern of deliberate concealment was clear and undeniable. March 15th, Brennan claimed at community meeting that no environmental review was necessary, because this is just routine maintenance. Made no mention of receiving my 127-page professional assessment 3 days earlier. April 3rd, board meeting. Brennan dismissed resident concerns about clearing oak grove by stating environmental extremists always oppose progress. When asked directly about professional environmental input, he said, "We haven't received any credible expert analysis." May 17th, community barbecue. Brennan told the Morrison family that I was known for making up credentials and spreading panic. He specifically said, "I had no relevant expertise in environmental issues." Each entry painted a picture of systematic deception. Brennan hadn't just ignored Elena's warnings, he'd actively concealed them while publicly attacking her. Credibility? The fifth box contained Elena's secret weapon she'd been in contact with, the County Emergency Management Office, and the State Environmental Protection Agency throughout the entire ordeal. Both agencies had copies of her assessment and had requested regular updates on the HOA's response to her recommendations. When Hurricane Delilah struck exactly as Elena had predicted, both agencies had launched investigations into why her warnings had been ignored. The Environmental Protection Agency wants to interview you about potential violations of state flood management regulations. This is dated 3 days ago. Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. The state requires HOAs to consider professional environmental assessments when making decisions that affect flood management. Brennan's company could lose their contractor's license if it's proven they deliberately ignored expert warnings to protect their own financial interests. The final box contained Elena's ultimate insurance policy complete documentation of the financial relationships between Brennan's construction company and the HOA through public records. Requests and corporate filings, Elena had traced a pattern of exclusive contracts, inflated billing, and mutual back-scratching that went back 5 years. Brennan and Associates had received over $1.2 million in HOA contracts during that period, often without competitive bidding. "This is like a corruption investigation," Sophia observed. "It is a corruption investigation," Elena replied. "I just haven't decided whether to turn it over to the district attorney or use it to force Brennan's resignation." As they finished organizing the evidence, Elena felt a transformation taking place within herself. For 8 months, she'd tried to be diplomatic, reasonable, and non-confrontational. She'd absorbed personal attacks, endured social isolation, and watched her professional warnings be dismissed as the ravings of an unstable housewife. She'd hoped that being right would be enough, but Hurricane Delilah had changed the equation. Her neighbors had suffered millions of dollars in preventable damage because one corrupt man had prioritized personal profit over community safety. Her daughter was being harassed at school because of lies designed to protect a contractor's reputation. Her own reputation, built over 20 years of preventing exactly this kind of disaster, had been deliberately destroyed by someone who knew better. Elena was done being the victim. Tomorrow, she would begin her counterattack. The war for truth was about to begin, and she had documentation that would be Brennan's downfall. Elena woke up on August 16th to find her car tires slashed and environmental terrorist keyed into the paint of her driver's side door. Sophia discovered the damage first, standing in the driveway in her school clothes with tears of rage streaming down her face. "I hate them," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "I hate all of them." Elena surveyed the damage while calling the police for the second time in 12 hours. The responding officer, Deputy Martinez, looked genuinely sympathetic, but delivered the same message as his colleague from the night before. "Without witnesses or security footage, there's not much we can do," he said. "These property damage cases are almost impossible to prosecute unless someone confesses or we catch them in the act." Officer Martinez, Elena said carefully, "Is it possible that targeting someone who provided professional warnings about a disaster that killed 3 people might constitute intimidation of a potential witness in a criminal investigation?" Martinez's expression shifted. "Ma'am, are you saying you're a witness in a criminal case?" Elena handed him a business card she'd printed that morning. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, environmental engineering consultant, FEMA disaster response specialist. The card listed her MIT credentials and her role in preventing the Baton Rouge levee failure. The State Environmental Protection Agency and the County Emergency Management Office have both requested interviews about my ignored flood warnings, she continued. Someone with a financial interest in covering up gross negligence is now targeting my family with escalating property crimes. Martinez was taking notes now, his casual dismissal replaced by professional attention. Dr. Vasquez, have you reported these threats to the agencies investigating the flood response? I'm meeting with State EPA investigator Sarah Chen this afternoon, Elena replied. I'll be documenting the harassment campaign as part of my formal witness statement. After Martinez left with photographs and a detailed incident report, Elena drove Sophia to school in a rental car. The atmosphere in the vehicle was thick with tension and unspoken fears. Mom, Sophia said as they pulled into the high school parking lot, Emma Rodriguez says her dad thinks you might be right about the HOA stuff, but her mom says you're still causing property values to drop just by making a big deal about it. Elena felt her heart break a little. Tom Rodriguez had seemed genuinely supportive at the emergency meeting, but now even her potential allies were being pressured to distance themselves from her family. Sophia, I need you to understand something, Elena said, turning to face her. Daughter, sometimes doing the right thing costs more than people want to pay. But the alternative letting lies destroy people's lives costs even more. How much more? Elena thought about the 3 deaths from Hurricane Delilah, an elderly man who'd suffered a heart attack while trying to sandbag his flooded basement, a teenager who'd been struck by a falling tree on the compromised trail system, and a mother of 2 who'd been swept away by floodwaters in the drainage channel that Brennan's system had turned into a raging river. More than money, Elena said quietly. Much more than money. Sophia squeezed her hand before getting out of the car. Fight them, Mom. Fight them with everything you've got. Elena's meeting with EPA investigator Sarah Chen took place in a sterile conference room at the county offices. Chen was younger than Elena had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of focused intensity that Elena recognized from her own early career in disaster response. Dr. Vasquez, Chen began. I've reviewed your March environmental assessment, and frankly, the accuracy of your predictions is extraordinary. Hurricane Delilah followed your projected path almost exactly, and the damage patterns match your risk maps within a 95% correlation. Thank you, Elena said. I wish I'd been wrong. So do the families of the 3 people who died, Chen replied grimly. Dr. Vasquez, I need to ask you directly. In your professional opinion, would implementing your recommendations have prevented those deaths? Elena had dreaded this question because she knew the answer would haunt her forever. That's the heart. Attack victim died trying to prevent basement flooding that my drainage recommendations would have eliminated. The teenager died when a tree fell across the trail section I'd marked as structurally compromised due to root system damage from construction activities. The mother who drowned was swept away by flood surges through the artificial drainage channel I'd specifically warned would become dangerous during major storms. Chen was taking notes, but her expression was increasingly grim. Dr. Vasquez, based on your experience with federal disaster response, how would you characterize the HOA's handling of your professional warnings? Elena had prepared for this question by reviewing similar cases from her FEMA consultation work. It appears to constitute gross negligence, rising to the level of criminal liability. The HOA received specific, professional warnings about life-threatening risks to community members. They not only ignored those warnings, but actively concealed them while proceeding with construction activities that increased the danger, and the personal attacks on your credibility, witness intimidation designed to prevent me from pursuing official channels for reporting the ignored warnings. Elena pulled out her documentation of the harassment campaign. The escalation from social ostracism to property damage coincides directly with the timeline of official investigations into the HOA's conduct. Chen reviewed the photographs of Elena's vandalized property, the timeline of social media harassment, and the documented threats Elena had received through anonymous notes and voicemails. Dr. Vasquez, I have to ask why didn't you go directly to state authorities when the HOA first ignored your warnings? Elena had been asking herself the same question for weeks, because I wanted to give them a chance to do the right thing. I'd spent my entire career swooping in as the outside expert. Who knew better than the local people? When I moved to Riverside Meadows, I wanted to be part of a community, not just the person who told everyone else what they were doing wrong. And now I understand that being part of a community sometimes means being the person who fights for the community's survival, even when the community doesn't want to hear it. Chen closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. Dr. Vasquez, the state is pursuing multiple avenues of investigation. The environmental violations alone could result in significant fines and contractor license revocations. The question is whether we can build a criminal case for negligent homicide. Elena felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. 3 people were dead because her warnings had been ignored, and now she was being asked to help send the people responsible to prison. It wasn't the life she'd wanted when she'd moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood, but it was the life that circumstances had forced upon her. I'll provide whatever testimony and documentation you need, Elena said, but I want you to understand something, Ms. Chen. This isn't about revenge for me. This is about making sure it never happens again. I understand, Dr. Vasquez, but I should warn you if we move forward with criminal charges. The harassment you've experienced so far will seem mild by comparison. Defense attorneys will attack everything about you, your family, your professional background, and your motivations. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Elena thought about Sophia's tears that morning, about her vandalized home, about the 3 families planning funerals for preventable deaths. She thought about the next hurricane season and the other communities that might face similar disasters if corrupt officials learned they could silence expert warnings with intimidation campaigns. Ms. Chen, Elena said, I've spent 20 years preparing for disasters. I'm prepared for this one too. As she left the county building, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. Mom, someone posted your Time magazine article on the school Facebook page. Everyone's talking about it. I think people are starting to realize who you really are. Elena smiled, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. The truth was finally beginning to spread faster than the lies. The fight was far from over, but the tide was starting to turn. The second emergency HOA meeting was called for August 22, 2024. After Elena's EPA interview became public knowledge, by then, Sophia's strategic social media campaign had transformed the narrative completely. Her mother's Time magazine profile had been shared 847 times on local Facebook groups. Her federal disaster response credentials had been verified by 3 different news outlets, and her environmental assessment had been leaked to an investigative reporter from the Regional Tribune. Elena arrived at the community center to find news vans in the parking lot and protesters holding signs reading Brennan must go and listen to science, not corruption. The meeting room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Brennan looked haggard, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the desperate panic of someone whose lies were collapsing around him. His attorney sat beside him, frantically reviewing documents. Clearly unprepared for the media attention now focused on what had been intended as a quiet community dispute. Ladies and gentlemen, Brennan began, his voice lacking its usual authority, we're here tonight to discuss the completion of repairs to our trail system and to address certain misunderstandings about the decision-making process that led to the recent unfortunate events. Elena sat in the front row, flanked by Sophia and Tom Rodriguez, who had publicly switched sides after discovering the full extent of Elena's professional credentials. Behind them, she could feel the energy of a community that had finally learned the truth about what had been hidden from them. Mr. Brennan called out Dr. Patricia Williams. Before we discuss repairs, I think this community deserves answers about why a federal disaster response expert's warnings were concealed from us for 8 months. Brennan's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. On advice of counsel, Brennan said stiffly, I cannot comment on pending legal matters. What legal matters? Margaret Chen demanded. Are you saying there are criminal charges being considered? The room erupted in conversation. Elena hadn't mentioned the possibility of criminal charges to anyone except Sophia, but Brennan's lawyer had just confirmed that prosecution was a real possibility. Order. Order. Brennan banged his gavel frantically. We are not here to discuss legal speculation. We're here to move forward with community repairs. but the crowd was beyond his control now. Janet Morrison stood up, holding a copy of Elena's environmental assessment that had been circulating through the neighborhood for days. "Richard, this report shows that every single element of the hurricane damage was predictable and preventable," Morrison said, her voice shaking with fury. "Dr. Vasquez spent $47,000 of her own money to protect our community, and you buried her warnings so your construction company could profit from a system that killed 3 people. That's not we never." The legal implications of Brennan was floundering, his usual smooth talking points useless against documented evidence. Elena had planned to let others carry the attack, but seeing Brennan's desperate attempts to evade, responsibility triggered something deeper than professional outrage. This was personal now for Sophia, for the 3 families planning funerals. For every expert whose warnings had ever been silenced by corruption, she stood up slowly, and the room fell silent. "Mr. Brennan," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years in disaster response. "You received my environmental assessment on March 12th at 3:47 p.m. You read it because you responded the next day asking about the cost of implementation. When I told you the preventive measures would cost $180,000, you said that was unrealistic for routine maintenance work." Brennan's face went white. Elena's perfect recall of dates and details, a skill honed through years of congressional testimony, was destroying his ability to claim ignorance. "That's not how I remember." "You'll remember it exactly as I'm describing it," Elena interrupted, "because I have your email response dated March 13th at 11:23 a.m., in which you wrote, and I quote, "While we appreciate your thorough analysis, the board feels that such extensive preventive measures are not cost-effective for what our contractors assure us are standard drainage improvements." Sophia was recording everything on her phone, and Elena could see other residents doing the same. Brennan's every word was being preserved for posterity and potentially for criminal prosecution. "Furthermore," Elena continued, "when you realized that Hurricane Delilah had proven my assessment completely accurate, you made the conscious decision to destroy my reputation rather than admit your errors. You organized a campaign to paint me as an environmental extremist and a fraud. Knowing that I held federal credentials and that my warnings could have saved lives, I never organized any campaign," you told the Morrison family at the May 17th. "Community barbecue that I was known for making up credentials and spreading panic," Elena said. "You told them I had no relevant expertise in environmental issues. This was 2 months after receiving documentation of my MIT PhD and my role in preventing the Baton Rouge levee failure that would have flooded 12,000 homes. The specificity of Elena's recall was devastating." Brennan couldn't deny statements that multiple witnesses remembered, and his lawyer was looking increasingly desperate. "Dr. Vasquez," the lawyer interjected, "my client disputes your characterization of these conversations." "Your client can dispute whatever he wants," Elena replied calmly. "The EPA investigation will determine the accuracy of my characterizations based on witness interviews and documented evidence." The mention of the EPA investigation sent another wave of shock through the crowd. Elena watched recognition dawn on faces throughout the room. This wasn't just a community dispute anymore. This was a federal case with potential criminal implications. Tom Rodriguez stood up beside Elena. "Dr. Vasquez, can you tell us exactly what would have been different if the community had implemented your recommendations?" Elena had hoped someone would ask this question, because the answer would make the scope of Brennan's negligence undeniable. The Oak Grove buffer zone would have absorbed the initial flood surge. Preventing the water from reaching residential areas, she began, "The natural drainage channels I recommended would have dispersed floodwater safely through multiple exit points instead of concentrating it into the artificial channel that became a deadly river. The trail reinforcement measures would have prevented the tree fall that killed 16-year-old Marcus Stevens." The mention of Marcus Stevens by name hit the room like a physical blow. Elena had deliberately avoided personalizing the casualties until now, but she needed people to understand that these weren't abstract statistics, they were preventable tragedies. The basement flooding that caused Harold Chen's fatal heart attack would never have occurred, Elena continued. The erosion patterns that swept away Jennifer Martinez would have been impossible, because the water flow would have been controlled and dispersed rather than concentrated into destructive channels. Margaret Chen, Harold's widow, was openly weeping. Jennifer Martinez's sister, who had driven down from Orlando for the meeting, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "You're telling us," Jennifer's sister said, her voice breaking, "that my sister died because this man was more interested in making money than protecting people?" The silence that followed was absolute. Elena felt the weight of the Moment 3 family's grief, crystallizing into a demand for accountability that would be impossible to ignore. Brennan's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating the civil liability exposure from wrongful death lawsuits. But Elena wasn't finished. "There's one more thing this community needs to know," Elena said. "The same weather patterns that produced Hurricane Delilah are forecasted to return in late September. Without proper flood mitigation measures, the next major storm will produce similar destruction. Mr. Brennan's proposed repairs will fail just as catastrophically as his original drainage system, because they're based on the same flawed engineering principles that caused the disaster in the first place." The revelation that another disaster was imminent galvanized the crowd like an electric shock. Elena watched the community's anger transform into something more powerful, determination. Dr. Williams stood up, her physician's authority commanding attention. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership and the immediate implementation of Dr. Vasquez's environmental recommendation." "Seconded," called out 5 voices simultaneously. Brennan banged his gavel desperately. "This meeting is not authorized to Richard." Margaret Chen's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "Sit down and shut up. You've done enough damage." Elena watched 20 years of Brennan's community dominance evaporate in seconds. The man who had terrorized her family and concealed life-saving warnings was being stripped of power by the very people he'd thought he could manipulate forever. But even as victory approached, Elena knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Implementing her environmental plan would require navigating insurance companies, construction contracts, and legal challenges. Brennan wouldn't go quietly, and his allies would fight to protect their own financial interests. The war for her community's future was just beginning, but for the first time in 8 months, Elena felt like she had an army behind her. The vote was 127-3. In the history of Riverside Meadows, HOA, no leadership challenge had ever been so decisive or so swift. Brennan's removal from office was followed immediately by the election of Dr. Patricia Williams as interim president and Elena's appointment as chair of the newly created Environmental Safety Committee. But Elena's moment of victory was overshadowed by the arrival of Detective Ray Castellanos from the county sheriff's office. He approached Elena as the crowd was dispersing, his expression grim with the weight of what he had to discuss. "Dr. Vasquez, I need to speak with you about the criminal investigation," he said quietly. "We've received your documentation from the EPA, and the district attorney wants to move forward with charges." Elena felt Sophia's hand slip into hers as they followed Detective Castellanos to a quiet corner of the community center. The charges he outlined were more serious than Elena had imagined. 3 counts of negligent homicide, conspiracy to defraud, witness intimidation, and violations of state environmental protection laws. "The DA believes we can prove that Mr. Brennan and potentially other HOA board members knowingly concealed expert warnings about life-threatening risks to the community," Castellanos explained. "Your documentation provides a clear timeline of deliberate concealment and financial motivation." Elena looked around the community center, where her neighbors were discussing implementation timelines for her flood mitigation plan. 3 months ago, these same people had treated her like a pariah. Now they were entrusting her with their family's safety. "Detective Castellanos," Elena said, "what do you need from me? Your testimony will be the cornerstone of the prosecution's case," he replied. "But I have to warn you, Brennan's legal team is already preparing a character assassination campaign. They're going to claim you're an unstable outsider who manipulated a tragedy to gain power and attention." Sophia squeezed Elena's hand tighter. "Mom, they can't actually believe that will work after everything that's come out, can they?" Detective Castellanos' expression suggested they might try anyway. "Dr. Vasquez, defense attorneys can be very creative. When their clients are facing potential prison time, they'll attack your motivations for moving to Riverside Meadows, your divorce, your daughter's social media campaign. Anything they can use to suggest you orchestrated this entire situation for personal gain." Elena thought about the $47,000 she'd spent on environmental analysis. the months of social isolation, the harassment and vandalism her family had endured. The idea that anyone could portray her as the villain in this story seemed absurd, but she'd seen enough legal proceedings to know that truth and justice weren't always the same thing. "When do you need my testimony?" she asked. "The grand jury convenes next week," Castellanos replied. "But Dr. Vasquez, there's something else you should know. The investigation has expanded beyond just the HOA leadership. We're looking at potential federal charges related to construction fraud and environmental crimes." Elena felt the scope of the case expanding around her like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. What had started as a community dispute about trail maintenance had become a federal investigation into corruption, negligence, and criminal conspiracy. "How many people are involved?" Sophia asked. "That's still being determined," Castellanos said diplomatically. "But Dr. Vasquez, your professional reputation and documented expertise have made this case much stronger than typical negligence prosecutions. The fact that you're a federal disaster response specialist who accurately predicted every aspect of the disaster makes it very difficult for defendants to claim the deaths were unforeseeable." As Detective Castellanos left, Elena found herself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to discuss the implementation of her flood mitigation plan. The irony wasn't lost on her, the same people who had shunned her. Warnings 8 months ago were now treating every word she spoke as gospel. Tom Rodriguez approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "Dr. Vasquez, we've got the insurance. Adjusters requesting a meeting with you tomorrow. They want to understand how much of the damage could have been prevented and what that means for our claims." Elena nodded, already anticipating the insurance company's strategy. If her recommendations could have prevented 90% of the storm damage, the insurers would argue that the community's failure to implement those recommendations constituted gross negligence that voided their coverage obligations. "Tom, we need to be prepared for the insurance companies to use my assessment against us," Elena warned. "They're going to claim that ignoring professional warnings invalidates our policies." "Can they do that?" Margaret Chen asked, joining their conversation. "They can try," Elena replied, "but the key legal question will be whether the community knew about my warnings. Since Brennan concealed my reports from the membership, the insurance companies can't claim the community made an informed decision to ignore expert advice." Dr. Williams, still adapting to her new role as HOA president, looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the legal situation. "Elena, I have to ask her. Looking at a situation where some families might not be covered for their storm damage." Elena had been dreading this question because the answer was potentially devastating for families who were already struggling with repair costs. It's possible. The insurance companies have teams of lawyers whose job is to find reasons to deny claims. My environmental assessment creates a paper trail that they can use to argue the damage was foreseeable and preventable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Channel 7 news reporter Amanda Chen, who had been covering the story since Elena's credentials became public. Elena had been avoiding media interviews, but the scope of the criminal investigation was making that strategy unsustainable. "Dr. Vasquez," Chen said, "can you comment on reports that the district attorney is considering federal charges in connection with the hurricane deaths?" Elena looked around at her neighbors, realizing that her answer would be quoted in news reports that would reach thousands of people. The quiet suburban life she'd sought was gone forever, replaced by a public role she'd never wanted but couldn't abandon. "Ms. Chen," Elena said carefully, "I can confirm that I'm cooperating fully with all law enforcement investigations. My only concern is ensuring that the mistakes that led to preventable deaths are never repeated in our community or any other community." "Do you believe criminal charges are appropriate in this case?" Elena thought about Harold Chen's widow, about Marcus Stevens' parents, about Jennifer Martinez's sister. She thought about the next hurricane season and the communities that might face similar disasters if corrupt officials learned they could silence expert warnings without consequences. "I believe that when people in positions of authority receive specific professional warnings about life-threatening risks to the communities they serve, and when those officials choose to conceal those warnings for personal financial gain, there must be accountability," Elena said. "The families who lost loved ones deserve justice, and other communities deserve protection from similar negligence." As the reporter moved on to interview other residents, Elena realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the quiet newcomer who'd hoped to blend into suburban anonymity. She was now the public face of a movement demanding accountability from elected officials and protection for expert voices in community. Decision-making. Sophia put her arm around her mother's shoulders as they walked to their rental car. Mom, are you ready for what comes next? Elena looked back at the community center, where her neighbors were still discussing the implementation of her flood mitigation plan. In 6 weeks, they would need to have new drainage systems in place before the next storm season began. In 6 months, the criminal trials would begin. In 6 years, her environmental protections might serve as a model for communities across the country. Sophia, I don't think anyone's ever ready for this kind of fight, Elena said. But I know we can't walk away from it. As they drove home, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from EPA investigator Sarah Chen. Dr. Vasquez, federal charges approved. Need to schedule witness prep session. This is going to be the biggest environmental crime prosecution in state history. Elena showed the message to Sophia, who smiled with fierce pride. Mom, Sophia said, I think you're about to become famous again. Elena smiled back, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope that justice was actually possible. The truth was finally stronger than the lies, and she was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Elena stood in the February rain, watching the completion of the Riverside Meadows Environmental Protection Project. The $180,000 in flood mitigation measures she'd originally recommended had grown into a $340,000 comprehensive ecosystem restoration program, funded by insurance settlements, federal grants, and a successful GoFundMe campaign that had raised $89,000. From supporters across the country, the Oak Grove buffer zones had been replanted with mature trees donated by the State Forestry Service. The natural drainage channels were lined with native plants that would absorb flood surges while preventing erosion. The trail system had been rebuilt using permeable materials that would withstand hurricane-force winds while allowing water to flow safely beneath the walkways. Most importantly, the community had survived the test. Hurricane Francine had struck in September 2024, with winds of 110 miles per hour and 22 inches of rains, stronger than Delilah, but Elena's mitigation systems had performed exactly as designed. No flooding, no trail damage, no casualties. The only destruction had been minor roof damage and power outages that were restored within 3 days. Dr. Vasquez called out Tom Rodriguez, who now served as the HOA's environmental safety coordinator. The county commissioners want to present you with a commendation for community service. Elena waved acknowledgement, but remained focused on the technical specifications for the new monitoring system that would provide early warning for future storms. Her role as environmental committee chair had evolved into something approaching a full-time job, coordinating with federal agencies, training other communities in flood mitigation techniques, and testifying in similar cases across 3 different states. Sophia jogged up the trail, now a senior preparing for college applications. To engineering programs, her essay about watching her mother fight systemic corruption had already earned her early admission to MIT's environmental engineering program. Mom, the reporter from Environmental Engineering magazine is here for your interview, Sophia said. And Detective Castellanos called. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Elena felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Richard Brennan had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for negligent homicide and conspiracy. To defraud, Brennan and associates had been banned from government contracts and ordered to pay $4.2 million in restitution to the families of the victims. But the legal victory felt hollow when Elena remembered the 3 funerals she'd attended. The families whose lives had been shattered by preventable deaths. Justice was important, but it couldn't bring back Harold Chen, Marcus Stevens, or Jennifer Martinez. The reporter from Environmental Engineering magazine was Lisa Park, a young journalist who specialized in stories about infrastructure failures and disaster prevention. Elena had agreed to the interview because she wanted other communities to learn from Riverside Meadows' experience. Dr. Vasquez Park began, "Your case has become a model for environmental whistleblower protection laws in 12 states. How do you feel about becoming the face of a national movement?" Elena looked around at her neighborhood, where children were playing safely on trails that could withstand the next hurricane, where families were living in homes protected by flood systems that had proven their effectiveness under the worst possible conditions. I never wanted to be the face of anything, Elena said honestly. I wanted to be a suburban mom whose biggest concern was whether Sophia was doing her homework. But I learned that sometimes protecting the people you love requires fighting battles you never wanted to fight. What advice would you give to other environmental professionals who face similar resistance from local officials? Elena had been asked this question dozens of times by reporters, congressional staffers, and EPA investigators. Her answer had evolved as she'd gained perspective on the broader implications of her experience. Document everything, Elena said. Keep detailed records of every warning you provide, every meeting you attend, every attempt to dismiss or silence your expertise. The truth is only as strong as your ability to prove it, and corrupt officials will always claim ignorance or misunderstanding. If you can't demonstrate their deliberate negligence, but also, she continued, don't assume that being right is enough. You have to be prepared to fight, not just for your professional recommendations, but for your personal reputation and your family's safety. Asterisk. People who profit from ignoring expert warnings will attack your character, your motives, and your credibility. You need to be emotionally prepared for that battle before you enter it. Park was taking detailed notes, clearly planning to feature Elena's advice prominently in her article, Dr. Vasquez, what's next for you professionally? Elena smiled, thinking about the offer she'd received the week before from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They wanted her to head a new division focused on community-based disaster prevention. With a staff of 50 engineers and a budget of $12 million to implement flood mitigation projects in vulnerable communities across the Southeast. I'm considering returning to federal service, Elena said, but this time, I want to focus on preventing disasters before they happen, rather than responding after communities have already been destroyed. And personally, Elena looked at Sophia, who was absorbed. In reviewing college application materials on her laptop, her daughter had chosen to study environmental engineering not because she'd been pushed in that direction, but because she'd witnessed firsthand the power of scientific expertise to save lives. When wielded by someone with the courage to fight for what was right, personally, I'm learning to balance being a mother with being a public advocate, Elena said. Sophia and I have both discovered that our family's strength comes from our willingness to stand up for our principles, even when it's difficult and dangerous. As the interview concluded, Elena received a text message from EPA investigator Sarah Chen, Dr. Vasquez. Congress is holding hearings on environmental crime enforcement next month. They've requested your testimony about the need for stronger whistleblower protections. Are you interested? Elena showed the message to Sophia, who grinned with pride. Mom, you're going to testify before Congress. Apparently so, Elena replied. How do you feel about your mother becoming even more famous? I think it's awesome, Sophia said. But I also think you should ask them to pass a law requiring communities to listen to expert warnings, not just protect the experts who provide them. Elena hugged her daughter, marveling at the young woman Sophia had become through their shared ordeal. The harassment, the vandalism, and the social isolation had been traumatic, but they had also revealed reserves of strength and determination that neither of them had known they possessed. As they walked home through the restored neighborhood, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 18 months ago, she'd been a divorced engineer seeking a quiet suburban life where her expertise would be irrelevant. Now she was a national advocate for environmental protection and governmental accountability, her story cited in legislation and court cases across the country. The transformation hadn't been chosen or welcome, but it had revealed something important about the relationship between personal safety and civic responsibility. Elena's attempt to protect her new community from environmental disaster had forced her to confront the broader question of how democratic societies should respond when expert knowledge conflicts with political or financial interests. Mom, Sophia said as they reached their front door, do you ever regret not just keeping quiet about the flood risks? Elena thought about Harold Chen's widow, who had become a close friend and ally in the fight for governmental accountability. She thought about Marcus Stevens' parents, who had established a scholarship fund for students pursuing environmental engineering degrees. She thought about Jennifer Martinez's sister, who had successfully lobbied for state legislation requiring HOAs to consider professional environmental assessments. I regret that people died because my warnings were ignored, Elena said, but I don't regret fighting to make sure it never happens again. As they entered their home, the garage door now repaired and painted, the security system installed after the harassment campaign, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since moving to Riverside Meadows. Peace, not the peace of anonymity she'd originally sought, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you fought for what was right and won outside. The February rain was feeding the restored oak groves and filling the natural drainage channels that would protect the community through the next hurricane season and beyond. Elena's expertise had finally found its proper place, not hidden away in suburban obscurity, but deployed in service of the community she'd chosen to call home. The fight for environmental justice was far from over. But Elena Vasquez was no longer fighting alone. She had a community behind her, a daughter beside her, and a nation watching to see what she would do next. The quiet suburban mom had become something she'd never expected, a voice for truth in an age when truth needed all the voices it could find.